Stop being so busy. A Zen sleep story for burnout. Right now, there is an aching static stiffness located across the center of your sacrum and lower pelvic bowl, pulling tightly into the small vertebrae of your lower lumbar spine. It is the distinct physical anchor of chronic overscheduling, the heavy somatic residue carried by someone who has spent the daylight hours driving their system through an endless succession of optimized tasks and performance targets. You are experiencing the deep structural exhaust of a life lived on the high wheel of constant productivity, where every single hour must be justified by an outward output, leaving your lower spine locked in a defensive forward lean even after the day has ended. Your lower back is holding the physical memory of 100 tiny obligations tonight, a rigid compression that remains active because your mind is already secretly optimizing the demands of tomorrow morning. The protective shelter of your room is adjusting to the deep winter hours, offering a cool, grounded sanctuary where the frantic momentum of your calendar can be allowed to coast to a complete stop. Outside, a quiet frost is settling across the low, dry brush of the valley floor, sealing the dark landscape in an unhurried, freezing stillness that requires no movement from the roots. Inside, the dry, resinous aroma of curing pine shavings drifts softly from a small wooden box on a low bench, mingling with the clean, thick scent of old lard wheel grease that has been rubbed into the wooden floor joints near the entryway. The low, deep blue glow of a single tallow candle, burning down in a shallow iron holder, casts long, soft shadows across the rough-sawn cedar wall panels, while the thick straw-stuffed rush mat beneath your hips swallows the heavy pressure of your lower tailbone. The unrefined, cool weave of the hemp sheeting beneath your thighs begins to pull the residual heat away from your skin, gently inviting the deep connective tissues of your lower pelvis to drop their alignment guard. If it feels right, take a slow breath, letting the full weight of your hips drop back into the stable center of the earth, allowing the infinite lists of your daily execution to remain completely unfinished in the dark. You are not broken, dear friend. What you are tracking in this deep, dull compression around your sacrum and lower back is not a personal failure, nor is it a sign that you have permanently lost your capacity for peace, because your thoughts continue to count the tasks you left behind. The profound fatigue you carry tonight is a wise, natural message, a stark physical indication that your system has simply run out of structural elasticity from trying to outperform its own human limits. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, and we will not demand that you immediately locate a state of perfect, effortless presence before you are allowed to rest. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight, and you do not need to cross off the remaining items on your list before your spine is allowed to unbuckle its armor. Right now, nothing is required of you now, and you are safe enough to soften. There is a profound, liberating paradox within the heart of Buddhist insight that speaks directly to this modern exhaustion. Through a surprising, unyielding truth, we live under the persistent illusion that our safety in the world is an active creation, believing that if we can only maintain a flawless sequence of actions and optimize our days, we will finally achieve the right to exist in peace. We treat our lives as a perpetual cartage business, constantly piling new obligations onto our schedule to outrun the terrifying fear of being insignificant or left behind. But the ancient wisdom of the Zen tradition reveals that suffering does not arise because you have left a task incomplete. The deepest agony takes root when the mind mistakes its active performance for its actual identity. This is the truth of the overweighted bamboo axle. When a rustic village handcart is loaded so excessively with heavy wood that its timber wall compresses, the axle pin begins to groan and splinter from pure friction, not because the wood is weak, but because it was never designed to carry the weight of an entire forest without a pause. The suffering is not the presence of the load, but the refusal to uncouple the frame. True rest is not the completion of the work, it is the realization that your value was never resting on the axle pin. Maybe you have felt this too, the sudden, hollow panic at midnight when you realize that despite executing every duty flawlessly, the internal space within your lower back still feels completely charred, compressed, and thinned. The mind turns inward, transforming this structural exhaustion into a harsh personal judgment, whispering that because you feel tired, You are fundamentally falling behind, lacking in discipline, and losing control of your life path. This is the mechanism that adds a second wound to the simple fatigue of a long day. The first pain is merely the raw physical limitation of a human body that has limits, runs out of fuel, and requires maintenance. The second pain is the cruel indictment you strike against your own spine, declaring that your exhaustion is a moral failing that must be corrected through even harder labor tomorrow. But the seasoned oak does not apologize to the timber yard for its weight, and the ungreased wood does not feel remorse for its creak under a heavy load. The stiffness you feel across your sacrum is merely a temporary residue of friction, completely unable to diminish the deep, untroubled presence that is holding your bed tonight. In a few moments, our attention will journey toward a small, shadow-filled timber shed at the edge of an autumn pine forest, where a young woodsman sat staring at a thick bamboo axle pin caked in dark wheel grease, carrying the exact same static stiffness that is binding your lower lumbar spine right now. But before we step onto that cold dirt floor, allow your awareness to notice the physical weight of your pelvic bowl. Let the deep spaces between your hip sockets and your lower ribs widen. Let the abdominal wall release its defensive bracing, and let the small muscles around your tailbone give up their tight coordination. You do not need to force anything tonight, and you do not have to guarantee that your life will feel organized before the morning light arrives. The world will manage its own heavy hauling without your constant supervision for the next few hours, and every optimized schedule, every unread message, and every overweighted cart can remain completely stranded in the dark. We spend so much of our life treating our performance as a bridge that must be continuously extended across the void, believing that if we allow the construction to stop for even a single day, we will fall instantly into ruin. We evaluate our stability by the length of our checklist, and then we wonder why our lower spine feels like cold iron when the daylight fades. But the vast winter plain does not feel a shred of guilt for remaining flat and empty beneath the stars, and the frozen grass does not apologize to the sky for freezing its growth. The exhaustion you hold does not come from the simple fact that you have things to do. It grows from the current resistance that refuses to let the cart sit empty, without demanding that your core immediately justify its existence through more motion. Let another breath arrive naturally, without you needing to measure its pacing or prove its depth. Let it move directly into the tight channels of your sacrum, down through the backs of your thighs, and deep into the very center of your lower back. You are nothing more than a living form resting in a quiet room, completely free from the timelines, metrics, and optimized structures of the waking world. In the deep silence that is growing between us, the cool winter air is moving through the dry brush outside, requiring no completed assignments and demanding no flawless performance before it offers you its peace. Let your awareness sink into the simple, unrefined texture of the hemp beneath your hips as we prepare to step onto the damp earthen floor of the timber shed, where the maker of the wheels is waiting to show us how to let the axle drop. Deep within the shadow-filled timber shed at the edge of the northern pine forest, where the early winter mist clung to the rough-cut cedar eaves, the air stayed thick with the quiet fragrance of drying pine shavings and cold earth. Inside this drafty workshop, a young woodcutter named Koi moved with a rigid, unyielding stiffness that seemed frozen into the very center of his pelvic bowl. His daily labor was to haul heavy logs down from the upper ridges using a traditional wooden handcart, a task he performed with a desperate, aggressive velocity. For many moons, Koi had been driven by an internal, relentless panic that if he stopped moving, if he left even a single fallen log on the mountain slope, or if his pile of kindling was smaller than the neighboring woodcutters, his entire worth as a provider would vanish like smoke in the winter wind. He optimized every hour of daylight, pushing through deep body aches, ignoring the warning groans of his muscles, and filling his schedule so tightly that his mind became a chaotic ledger of uncompleted tasks. Every evening, even while resting on his mat, Koji's lower spine remained locked in a tight defensive posture, his thoughts furiously arranging the transport routes for the next dawn. He treated the mountain paths not as a living forest, but as an endless performance arena where any delay was a fatal mistake. believing that his survival was a structure he had to build through constant acceleration. He loaded his handcart higher and higher, stacking green, sap-heavy pine timber onto the frame until the thick bamboo beams strained against their leather bindings. He wore his exhaustion like a shield. Yet the faster he ran down the slopes, the deeper the dull, compressed ache settled across his sacrum, leaving his lower body feeling like a locked iron gate. The keeper of the village carts was Elder Sheen, an old craftsman whose hands were permanently stained with the dark, heavy wheel grease of the valley, and whose movements held the unhurried, grounded presence of a great oak root. Sheehan did not spend his hours delivering abstract spiritual discourses to the young men of the village, choosing instead to sit on a low oak stool near the hearth, shaping timber pins and maintaining the structural frames of the working vehicles. He had been quietly observing the progressive hardening of Koji's walk, noting the dry, rhythmic screeching that echoed from the woodcutter's wheels every time he dragged his overweighted cart into the yard. On an afternoon when the low winter sky grew so dark that the pine needles outside turned a deep charcoal hue, Sheehan called the young man into the back of the grease-stained shed. The workspace was profoundly silent, save for the low, rhythmic crackle of a few pine knots burning in the stone forge and the cold wind whistling through the cracks in the siding. On the center of a worn oak trestle lay a thick, dried bamboo axle pin that had just been removed from Koji's cart, its surface caked in dark wheel grease and wood dust. Koji stood near the table, his lower back rigid, his thighs tense, bracing himself for a lecture on how he must work harder to pay for the repairs, his mind instantly racing to calculate how many extra hours he would need to haul tomorrow to make up for the lost time. The old cartwright did not point to the piles of unhauled logs outside, and he did not mention the tomorrow's delivery schedule. Instead, he reached down with a blunt wooden awl, tapped the compressed side of the greased bamboo pin, and asked Koji to look closely at what the relentless pressure had actually done to the structural core of the wood. Koji bent over the workbench, his breath catching in his throat with a sudden, heavy wave of emotional recognition as he examined the object under the dim tallow light. The bamboo pin had not snapped cleanly from an external blow, rather. Under the constant, excessive weight of the unmanaged loads, the internal fibers had compressed so tightly against each other that the natural hollow wall of the bamboo had completely collapsed inward, losing all its elasticity and turning into a dry, splintered mass that could no longer rotate within the hub. He looked at the elder craftsman, his lower back throbbing with a dull, unspent sorrow as he realized he had driven the vehicle to the very edge of ruin. He confessed, his lower pelvic muscles tightening against the weight of his vulnerability. That his own body felt exactly like this compressed pin, a rigid, ungreased space where he had been forcing his capacity to carry the weight of an entire mountain, leaving his lower spine entirely thinned, locked, and devoid of space. Elder Chin picked up the ruined axle pin, laid it quietly into the basket of scrap wood beneath the forge, and reached for a fresh, unworked piece of seasoned ash timber that had been curing in the shade for 3 winters. He held the raw wood out to the young man and told him that the error of the cart was not the weight of the logs or the steepness of the mountain trail, but the delusion that a structural pin can maintain its integrity by never allowing the frame to be uncoupled. Sheehan pointed out that the frantic pace did not clear the forest, it only destroyed the very instrument meant to navigate it. The suffocating stiffness Koji carried across his sacrum did not exist because he had duties to perform. It grew entirely from his own exhausting habit of keeping the cart loaded through the night, refusing to let the frame drop flat onto the earth because he feared what would remain if the performance stopped. Koji stood perfectly still on the damp dirt floor, the sharp, clean scent of the pine shavings and the thick aroma of the old wheel grease moving deep into his senses as his lower spine slowly began to drop its defensive brace. For the first time in many months, the rigid, static compression running across his pelvic bowl began to lose its edge, allowing a deep, unhurried breath to reach the lowest chambers of his abdomen. He looked at the empty wooden trestle, realizing that the absolute security he had been trying to build through constant acceleration was a phantom. The day was already finished. The paths were empty, and the only thing keeping the pressure alive was his own refusal to let the cart sit unburdened. Slowly, the heavy, unhurried stillness of that dark timber shed moves into the quiet arena of your own room tonight, letting the image of the uncoupled wood mirror the exact condition of your own compressed mind. You have been lying awake counting the tasks that remain unfinished, measuring the depth of the static stiffness inside your lower back, and letting the fear of standing still convince you that your existence is only valid when it is moving forward. You have believed that because you cannot clear the infinite horizon of your calendar, you are fundamentally disqualified from finding a home in the present. But the deep, unmeasured baseline of your true nature remains completely uncompromised, entirely separate from the weight that has compressed your spirit. Let the axle drop to the ground, allowing your awareness to settle into the wide, unburdened depth of this single hour. This reflection on the compressed bamboo axle and the dim timber shed is not telling us to abandon our responsibilities, nor is it asking us to become cold, unfeeling statues who do not care about building a stable life or caring for those who rely on our efforts. It is not an invitation to slip into a state of forced detachment, where we pretend that a heavy schedule or a mountain of unexpected obligations does not leave a genuine aching stiffness across our lower lumbar spine. Instead, it is showing us something much quieter, a gentle shift in internal alignment that allows us to meet the changing demands of our days without allowing that external momentum to crush our own structural core. The persistent, heavy pressure that locks your pelvic bowl tonight does not persist simply because you had a large stack of logs to haul down the trail. The deepest suffering takes root when the mind insists on holding that performance as an ongoing emergency that can never be uncoupled from your identity. When we look at this chronic overscheduling through the clear, simple lens of Buddhist insight, we see that what we often describe as attachment is actually that stubborn, defensive clenching in the lower back that declares, "Until my entire calendar is completely cleared and every possible task is flawlessly executed, my system is forbidden to experience a single moment of safety." It is the exhausting habit of locking our fundamental right to exist into a continuous display of output, desperately trying to accelerate the wheel just to outrun the phantom fear of our own insignificance. We treat our productivity as if it were a shield that must never show a single flaw to the world, and when the day leaves us depleted, we believe our actual value has been compromised. This is the modern reality of craving. It is the frantic, late-night looping that keeps us mentally organizing the logistics of tomorrow or checking our progress, hoping that one more completed task will finally grant us permission to rest. But a wooden cart body packed with green timber cannot dictate the thickness of the valley floor. No matter how many times you spin the wheel against the floorboards of your room, the labor of the afternoon has already ended. The mountain trail has already emptied. The logs have already settled into the shade. When we lie awake burning our vital energy to maintain these heavy definitions, we are participating in a quiet internal process that adds a second wound to the first. The first wound is simply the raw, physical limitation of a human body that has limits, runs out of fuel, and requires maintenance after a long day of movement. These experiences are genuinely heavy, but they belong to the basic, unpreventable texture of human life. The second wound, however, is the one we strike against our own sacrum when our thoughts turn inward and declare, "Because you have left something unfinished on the trail, you are fundamentally inadequate, undisciplined, and ruined." Let this quiet realization sit directly next to the static stiffness in the center of your pelvic bowl right now. Consider what happens when we replace that desperate desire for constant performance with simple, spacious awareness. This quality of mind is not a complex discipline that you must perform perfectly before you are permitted to let your muscles soften. It is simply the capacity to look directly at the heavy load of your daily calendar without allowing that weight to dictate the width of your current breath. It is the ability to observe the rigid pressure in your lower back, to label it gently as the old habit of defining yourself by your output, and to recognize that the compression belongs entirely to the wood, not to the wide, flat plane that is holding you tonight. When you allow the cart frame to sit unburdened on the dirt floor, without continuously spinning the wheels with your thoughts. You stop feeding the heat that keeps your spine raw. You let the day exist in the past while you remain open in the present room. Impermanence, when translated into the immediate texture of your evening rest, becomes an immense sanctuary for an overworked heart. It acts as a gentle reminder that the monumental pile of tasks you felt behind on was not a solid, eternal mountain trapped inside your soul. That grand collection of duties was a temporary arrangement of circumstances that belonged to a specific hour. It has no physical power to reach into the dark and diminish the deep, untroubled presence that is watching it tonight. The body lying in this bed is entirely separate from those uncompleted schedules, its pelvis capable of dropping into a clean, ancient rhythm that has never been restricted by the boundaries of an optimized timeline. You do not have to force your current muscles to maintain a defensive forward lean just to protect a performance record that has already returned to the silence of the forest side. True letting go does not mean you stop caring about your path, or that you pretend your responsibilities do not feel heavy. It means you stop using the length of your checklist as a metric to determine whether you are permitted to take a full, unhurried breath in the dark. It means you acknowledge the compressed, splintered channels of your past effort, look at the wreckage with a soft, non-judgmental eye, and then allow the axle to drop where it wills, without demanding that your life become perfectly organized before you are allowed to sleep. When you drop the expectation that your existence must always hold an intact display of productivity for the world to see, you discover that true compassion is the willingness to stand in your own empty center and hold your vulnerable frame with a tenderness that requires no external return. Right now, notice how effortlessly your body is managing its own survival in the dark, completely unconcerned with the heavy firewood you tried to weigh during the daylight hours. Your pulse does not check the status of your schedule before it agrees to warm your limbs, and your lungs do not demand an intact agreement from the valley before they open to receive the cool night breeze. You are already being sustained by a deep, natural intelligence that operates entirely outside the boundaries of human performance, resting securely within a night that requires no completed tasks before it offers you its peace. Let your awareness sink into the simple, unrefined texture of the hemp beneath your hips as we prepare to step onto the cool dirt floor of the mountain roadside shelter, where the wandering monk is waiting to show us the nature of the space that remains when the wheels go silent. If it feels right, let your attention gather very gently right along the broad, flat expanse of your sacrum, arriving at the exact physical parameters where that dull, static stiffness has been anchoring its energy. There is no need to actively push the memory of the incomplete schedule away, and there is no requirement to make your mind completely quiet by force. Simply notice the physical texture of the restriction, observing the stubborn, compressed weight behind your lower lumbar spine, as if you were merely looking at a heavy, ungreased bamboo axle resting on a dark wooden trestle, without any urgency to repair the splinters or force the timber walls to become instantly elastic. As you rest here in the deep, indigo-shadowed stillness of the late evening hour, perhaps you can invite a slow wave of softening to move through the deep muscles of your pelvic floor, your hip sockets, and the lowest vertebrae of your lower back. Let the small, rigid fibers surrounding your lower tailbone drop their protective brace, allowing the thighs to roll outward naturally, and let your lower abdomen feel wide, as if it were dissolving into the cool, damp earth beneath your frame. There is no pressure to achieve a sudden state of profound emotional healing in this moment, and even just noticing that your internal muscles still feel tight, guarded, or full of dry friction is entirely enough. You are simply taking stock of your own internal landscape, acknowledging where the mind has been buckle-strapping its armor against the vast uncertainty of an empty schedule. Right now, let the specific memory of that uncompleted task float up into your awareness, perhaps the exact moment where you felt you were falling behind, the exhaustion of watching your checklist lengthen without an answer, or the general, heavy worry that you will be permanently cut off from safety if anyone sees the unexecuted space in your timeline. Do not try to analyze the validity of the past effort, and do not try to fix the productivity record of the day that is gone. Instead, just name the emotional pattern that is currently tightening across your sacrum. You might say to yourself, very quietly, this is the habit of loading the empty cart, or this is the old performance heat, trying to force the axle to turn. Just by naming it, you are stepping out of the dark, urgent internal arena and standing beside Elder Sheehan in the quiet timber shed, looking at the compressed wood dust from a place of unhurried safety. Imagine that your remaining obligations are like that heavy, compressed bamboo axle pin, its natural fiber wall having become hardened and unyielding from hours of continuous dry movement. Look at its structural shape in your mind's eye. See how many times your thoughts have gripped that rough material today, fixing your sight entirely upon the spent attachment, letting that hot restriction convince you that your true nature has been permanently ruined. In this quiet space, if it feels comfortable, imagine taking that heavy, burning need to secure an outward output, that persistent wish to hide your natural vulnerability beneath a mountain of wood, and allowing it to slide quietly out of the iron wheel hub. You do not have to build a bridge across the valley with your exhaustion, and you do not have to clear the infinite horizon. You are simply setting the frame down on the earth while you step back into your own breathing body. Watch what happens to the internal space across your lower back as you let the responsibility sit outside of your identity. Perhaps the image of the compressed dry axle begins to change its texture under the steady, cool sweep of the winter evening. Imagine the heavy wooden cart body being uncoupled from the wheels entirely, slid off the heavy chassis, and allowed to sit perfectly flat, unladen, and low upon the stable dark mud of the timber yard. The faint, resinous aroma of curing pine shavings rises from the lower bench, filling the room with a stable, grounded quality that has nothing to do with the forced execution of tasks. The mountain does not collapse, and the floorboards remain completely solid beneath your weight, holding their space with absolute security. The dust on the bench does not diminish the capacity of the wood to remain steady. It is simply a layer of sand in the room, entirely separate from the deep, unmeasured plain that is holding you tonight. If your thoughts begin to drift back toward the logging trails, the expectations of the village markets, or the schedules you wish you could optimize to prove your absolute worth, you can return to the simple, rhythmic expansion of your lower lungs whenever you are ready. There is no failure in a mind that wanders back to its wreckage. The slow hiss of the candle outside the window pane does not apologize for moving in the dark, and your memories are no different from that natural occurrence. They are simply configurations resting in your vast open hall of awareness, and they cannot permanently break your true self unless you choose to believe that you are the compressed bamboo axle. Nothing needs to be forced tonight, dear friend. You are not required to empty your heart of its friction through an act of sheer will, and you do not have to guarantee that your path will feel clear before the morning light arrives. You are simply a living form, letting the heavy, unalterable roles of the performer rest on the table, while the unmoving dark continues to cradle your center, leaving your inner vault wide, unencored, and deeply at peace. Further along the rocky mountain pass, where the narrow dirt track cut through patches of dry, frost-bitten brush, a small, isolated roadside shelter offered temporary refuge from the early winter winds. The air within this simple, timber-framed outpost always carried the specific scent of cold earth, weathered pine, and the faint, dry odor of old iron rust from discarded wagon fixtures. In this solitary setting worked Raiden, a young apprentice timber hauler whose entire body carried a rigid, forward-leaning strain that seemed anchored deeply into the center of his lower spine. His livelihood depended on navigating a heavy wooden cart loaded with logs down to the valley settlements, a task he pursued with a fierce, competitive urgency. For weeks, Raiden had been locked in an intense, silent race against the other haulers of the ridge, driven by a biting terror that if he paused to rest, if he fell behind the daily transit tallies, or if he admitted that the freezing weather was draining his physical stamina, he would be judged as weak, useless, and entirely cast out from the respect of his peers. This fear of being left behind turned every delivery into an aggressive campaign against time, prompting him to optimize his movements so strictly that he refused to inspect his vehicle or halt for simple maintenance. Even when the mountain rains turned the dirt tracks into heavy, clinging clay, he loaded his vehicle with massive green cedar logs, stacking the timber high above the sideboards until the frame creaked in protest, using the sheer momentum of his panic to push through the swelling, static soreness that locked his sacrum. He operated under the stubborn illusion that his worth as a hauler was a score he had to actively maintain through relentless acceleration, treating the creaking complaints of his vehicle not as a call for grease, but as a personal insult that had to be overcome by pulling harder against the leather harness. Staying at the roadside shelter that evening was Master Tessin, a wandering monk who had spent his younger years as a long-distance courier across the northern provinces before putting down his travel satchel to live in quiet contemplation. Tessin possessed the slow, heavy stability of a stone foundation, his expressions holding the neutral, unhurried space of a windless winter sky, and his hands bearing the deep calluses of a man who knew the precise limits of wood, iron, and leather. He did not spend his time delivering complex theological explanations to the travelers who stopped at the shelter, choosing instead to sit by the small charcoal brazier, quietly rubbing fat into old harness straps or checking the alignment of the iron linchpins left behind by previous drivers. He had been silently tracking the progressive hardening of Raiden's posture, noting the harsh, metallic snapping sound that echoed from the wheel hubs every time the young man forced his overweighted cart over the frozen ruts of the road. As the twilight faded into a dark indigo winter night, a sudden flurry of freezing sleet began to strike the paper windows of the shelter, reducing the visibility outside to nothing but a shifting wall of gray fog. Inside, the room stayed profoundly still, save for the low, rhythmic hiss of a single tallow wick and the steady, cold draft moving through the floorboards. On the center of a low cedar bench lay a cracked wooden linchpin that Raiden had frantically hammered out of his left wheel hub just before dark, its seasoned oak surface deeply scored, thinned, and covered in dark, grit-packed grease. Raiden stood over the bench, his lower back locked in an aching curve, his thighs rigid with tension, his fingers gripping an iron mallet as he prepared to force the damaged pin back into the axle, his mind racing with a furious anxiety that if he did not fix the wheel immediately, the other haulers would pass his position before the dawn broke. The old courier did not take the mallet away, and he did not comment on the competitive greed that was driving the young man's frantic repair. Instead, Tessin reached out, picked up a small horn scoop filled with cold, lard wheel grease, dropped a dollop directly onto the deep, scored crack of the thinned wooden pin, and asked Raiden to consider whether the split in the timber arrived because the road was too rough, or because the driver refused to allow the wheel the necessary slack to find its own balance. Raiden froze, his arm remaining raised in the dim light, his breath catching in his throat with a sudden, painful wave of emotional recognition as he looked at the grease spreading over the damaged oak. The linchpin had not broken from an unexpected stone on the path, rather, because he had kept the wheel pinned so tightly against the hub without ever pausing to grease the assembly or uncouple the load during the downpour. The dry friction had thinned the wood until it could no longer hold the rotating weight. He looked at the quiet monk, his lower lumbar spine throbbing with a deep, unspent exhaustion, as he realized he had driven his vehicle into a structural dead end out of pure stubborn pride. He confessed, his lower pelvic floor tightening against the weight of his vulnerability, that his own inner life felt exactly like this thinned, cracked pin, a rigid, ungreased space where he had been forcing his capacity to maintain an impossible speed, believing that if he stopped to allow his system a single day of slack, he would be exposed as a complete failure. The old monk took the iron mallet from Raiden's hand, laid it quietly on the dirt floor, and pointed to a spare basket of seasoned ash pins, resting in the corner of the hearth, showing him that the materials for renewal were already present in the room, if he would only stop the frantic hammering. Tessin looked at the young hauler and told him that the transformation of the spirit does not manifest because a man never encounters a cracked wheel or a heavy trail, but because he learns the wisdom of sitting quietly, with the uncertainty of the pause. The monk explained that the frantic hurry did not change the distance to the valley, It only ensured that the vehicle would destroy itself before the destination was ever reached. The static stiffness Raiden carried across his sacrum did not exist because he had a cart to pull it. Grew entirely from his habit of treating every anxious thought as an absolute command, believing he had to conquer the mountain tonight to earn his right to exist tomorrow. Raiden stood perfectly still in the dim shelter, the clean, dry scent of the pine logs outside, and the thick aroma of the old wheel grease moving deep into his consciousness as he made one small, profound shift in his relationship with his own suffering. He lowered his shoulders, put down the urge to fix the wheel by force, and simply sat down on the low stool by the charcoal brazier, choosing to live with the unfinished repair in the dark. He did not become magically perfect or free from ambition in that single moment, but he stopped the mechanical habit of treating his panic as an absolute truth, allowing his lower spine to yield to the support of the seat without needing to master the road tonight. The cart was stranded, the linchpin was cracked, and his competitors might indeed pass him in the morning. But he finally permitted his pelvic bowl to drop its defensive forward brace, accepting the reality of his human limitations without wrapping it in the language of personal shame. Slowly, the heavy, unhurried stillness of that mountain roadside shelter moves into the quiet arena of your own room tonight, letting the image of the resting vehicle mirror the exact condition of your own overscheduled mind. You have been lying awake replaying the tasks you could not finish, measuring the depth of the static stiffness inside your lower lumbar spine, and letting the fear of lag convince you that your existence is only valid when it is executing a performance. You have believed that if you allow the wheel to have a single inch of slack, your entire life path will slide into absolute ruin. But the deep, unmeasured presence of your true nature remains completely uncompromised, entirely separate from the weight that has thinned your spirit. Let the tools rest on the floorboards, allowing your awareness to settle into the wide, unburdened depth of this single hour. When we allow our attention to settle into the quiet spaces of our own late-night reflections, we begin to decode the hidden emotional engine that converts the natural fatigue of life into an ongoing sentence of internal friction. We often assume that our physical exhaustion is a direct consequence of the visible tasks we performed, or the actual hours we spent managing our outward responsibilities. But if you observe the static stiffness currently situated right across the center of your sacrum, you will find that the real consumer of your vitality is the continuous hidden act of resistance. It is the energetic strain of refusing to let the natural rhythm of your capacities hold an empty space, the desperate attempt to manipulate the fluid uncertainty of the world through the frantic application of your own suffering. We treat our minds as an active laboratory of defense, continuously replaying the past and rebuilding the overweighted cart with the memory of every missed target, operating under the tragic delusion that if we keep our inner core raw and alert, we will somehow secure our worth against the changing opinions of others. This is the exact point where we can begin to separate the original weight of existence from the elaborate psychological armor the mind builds on top of it. Buddhist wisdom approaches this dilemma with a beautiful direct distinction between the first pain and the second pain. The first pain is simply the raw, unpolished impact of being alive in a world constructed out of unpredictable timelines and natural human limitations. It is the sudden arrival of an overwhelming schedule. It is the natural vulnerability of carrying a heavy investment in a shared craft or project. It is the simple reality of being a human who feels tired, thinned, or sore when the day demands more than your muscles can easily bear. These occurrences are genuinely heavy, yes, but they belong to the basic unpreventable weather of our daily reality. We cannot control the arrival of the first pain, for the freezing sleet on the road does not ask the permission of the timber hauler before it turns the mountain path into heavy mud. The true torment begins when our thoughts take that first pain and knead it into a permanent moral identity, actively constructing the second pain out of our own resistance. The second pain is the elaborate mental trial we host right along our pelvic bowl and lower spine, where we translate a temporary pattern of overscheduling into a definitive commentary on our absolute value. We do not simply notice that we are feeling depleted or stuck. The mind turns inward and whispers, because you had to leave that task incomplete. You are fundamentally inadequate, fraudulent, and banned from true peace. We do not just navigate an intense period of lag, our thoughts declare. This cracked linchpin is proof that your entire life path is inherently defective. This is the mechanism of turning a temporary thin timber into a solid identity. The unfortunate habit of mistaking a natural, empty space for an absolute pocket of rot that must be scrubbed away with frantic dry labor. When we exist within this pattern of self-judgment, our awareness spends its late night hours rehearsing the future and replaying the past, frantically attempting to build a wall of hypervigilance against the terrifying landscape of human vulnerability. We stay awake repeating every item we left undone, because we believe that our burning anxiety is a form of protection, that if we keep the inner dialogue sharp and critical, we will somehow force ourselves to be perfectly unassailable tomorrow. We develop an insatiable need for internal approval, trying to fix the self through a subtle application of shame, using our self-punishment as a temporary payment to satisfy the internal prosecutor we carry in our skin. But trying to heal your exhausted spirit through the accumulation of mental friction is like trying to preserve a cracked oak pin by hammering it tighter with a heavy iron mallet. The splits remain trapped in the center, waiting to restrict your natural breathing the moment the light fades. True inner transformation does not manifest because you have forced every single flaw to disappear from your character through sheer willpower. It begins with the radical, quiet realization that peace is not the absence of difficulty. It is an entirely different relationship with the difficulty itself. It is the willingness to stand in the damp roadside shelter without immediately picking up the heavy iron tool to strike your own spine. When you allow the reality of the stranded cart to exist without transforming it into an absolute verdict on your soul, you are stopping the second pain before it can plant its roots in your body. You are choosing to sit quietly among the cedar beams in the dark, letting the repair remain unfinished, and letting the inner room be vast, without needing to apologize to the universe for the lack of momentum running through your foundation. As you let the frame support the heavy framework of your hips right now, notice how the desperate urge to appear perfectly optimized begins to lose its grip when it is met with simple, non-judgmental presence. You do not have to settle the record of your entire calendar before the night ends, and you do not need to guarantee that your path will feel clear by tomorrow morning. The path toward inner freedom does not ask you to become a magically perfect machine that never experiences the sting of fatigue or doubt. It simply requires the very small, very steady discipline of noticing the static stiffness along your lower spine, naming it as the old performance pretense, and refusing to give its declarations the authority of truth. You are the vast, open workspace that holds both the raw timber and the quiet charcoal brazier. You are not the grit-packed wheel dust that is currently dropping away in the dark. In a moment, this gentle insight will move even closer to the small, ordinary triggers of your modern life, showing us how to carry this soft hand into the waking world without guilt. But for now, let your attention sink down into the quiet, unmoving center of your pelvis. Let your lower lumbar vertebrae expand outward on their own natural rhythm, taking up all the space they require in the indigo shadows, completely free from the narrow metrics of outward performance. You are safe enough to drop the protective armor right here, leaving your spirit as unpolished, wide, and supportive as the heavy floorboards before the first timber cart was ever dragged across their surface. Now let this quiet understanding step softly across the centuries, moving out of the silent mountain roadside shelters and directly into the small electric friction of your ordinary evening. The dry, compressed bamboo axle and the cracked oak linchpin we have been exploring are not abstract concepts designed to live only within an old wilderness archive. They are the exact configurations of energy you hold down in your sacrum and your lower lumbar spine when you lie awake at midnight, staring at the blank screen of your phone, waiting for a text message or a calendar update that might validate your choices or offer a temporary reassurance that you have not permanently failed the metric of productivity. We live so much of our modern lives inside this digital hypervigilance, repeatedly checking our devices for an external confirmation of our worth, replaying a minor professional mistake or an uncompleted schedule, as if the sheer force of our anxiety could somehow rewrite the reality of our day. We perform the role of the unshakable hauler during the daylight hours, smiling warmly while feeling an immense heavy thickness inside our chest, carrying the constant worry that we are fundamentally falling behind our peers, or that our true, unadorned self is simply not enough to sustain our place on the trail. You can begin to transform this exhausting mechanism right in the middle of the very moments that cause your breathing to shallow, recognizing that peace is not an allure-nothing victory, but a quality practiced in the smallest, most unexceptional slivers of the day. When you find yourself caught in the frantic urge to control a relationship, check your notifications for reassurance, or fear the absolute uncertainty of the future, you are fully permitted to pause. A single, slow breath taken before you offer an answer or look at your screen is a profound form of wisdom. It is a quiet, somatic realization that not every self-critical thought deserves your immediate obedience, and not every heavy feeling is an absolute command that must be followed into a Latinite internal courtroom. You can care deeply about the people in your life without gripping the dry harness so tightly that you tear the skin of your own spirit. You are simply stepping out into the wide room of your own presence, letting the dusty residue of your daily interactions pass over your mind without allowing it to compromise the permanent, load-bearing foundation of your true wooden frame. Perhaps you have spent years operating under the hidden law that your right to rest must be bought with a continuous display of flawless execution, and that wanting to let your eyes close while your inner schedule remains unresolved is a form of guilt-ridden failure. We treat our rest as a luxury that must be earned through absolute competence, fearing that if we stop carrying the weight of the logs or analyzing our vulnerability, we will be left completely exposed in the dark. But the seasoned ash does not feel a shred of remorse for holding only an unladen chassis, and the raw cedar beams do not apologize to the ridge for letting their space remain empty under the fog. You can rest without earning it first. Your exhaustion is not a moral debt that must be settled through hours of overthinking. It is simply the natural voice of an internal posture that has run out of vital energy from trying to push an overweighted cart through sheer force of will. It is entirely possible to navigate your modern daily realities, the unuttered arguments, the missed markers, and the uneven paths without allowing the lack of external validation to crush your own pelvic bowl. When we attempt to control the past or hide our natural fatigue through the continuous application of our own shame, we are acting like Raiden before his hands were uncurled, refusing to let the reality of the cracked pin exist as a natural configuration of a vast, shifting world. True inner freedom begins when you allow your living biography to be offered to the universe with a loose, receptive hand. You can maintain your daily responsibilities, contemplate your growth, or rest your body with the simple, unforced presence of raw timber, letting the surface pattern exist without demanding that it match a standard of absolute perfection. The next time the creeping burning of exhaustion settles deep into your lower spine, when you find yourself comparing your hidden, tired routine to the manufactured triumphs of those around you, look down at the quiet weight of your own posture and take a slow breath. The goal you missed or the checklist you could not deliver is merely the external weather of a long, unpredictable human existence. You do not have to pretend the internal void did not feel heavy, and you do not have to force an immediate state of complete transformation before the raw edge of your exhaustion has even cooled. It is completely enough to sit with the uncertainty of your own unfinished healing, letting the irregular fragments of your day rest on the bench without needing to stamp them with the label of permanent ruin. In a few moments, the remaining definitions and standards of the daylight hours will dissolve entirely into the dark, leaving nothing but the vast protective space of this midnight room. As your limbs prepare to surrender their final defensive postures, release the illusion that you must secure every single boundary of your public identity before you are permitted to let your sacrum relax. The expectations of the day carry no authority in this quiet sanctuary, and the unresolved demands can remain suspended in the cool mist outside your window. Let your attention drop back down into the steady, unhurried rise and fall of your lower lungs, knowing that the load-bearing substance of your true nature is already fully intact, completely wide, and entirely at peace. The dark hour has fully arrived now, and the quiet gravity of the night is settling over your bed like the thick, unmoving mist that holds the upper mountain terraces in absolute stillness. Every single effort you made today, every tireless defense you tried to build beneath your lower back, and every anxious reach for reassurance has dropped its momentum, dissolving into the silence of this indigo-shadowed room. The heavy, unalterable expectations of the distant market valley are no longer pulling at your sacrum. They have slid away, falling through the floorboards into the damp earth, leaving your internal vault completely empty, spacious, and calm. Your hip sockets and your lower spine are sinking a fraction of an inch deeper into the surface beneath you, as if the heavy wood of your inner nature were finally remembering its relationship with the steady, load-bearing foundation of the deep earth. Let your breathing become very small, very quiet, and entirely effortless. There is absolutely no need to regulate the air as it moves down through your torso. The body knows how to expand and soften on its own time, like the slow, steady movement of the mountain frost passing directly through the open framework of the roadside shelter. With every long, unheard release of breath, the distinct, static stiffness that you held across your pelvic bowl is letting go of its grip. The discordant lines of your uncompleted schedules are no longer being tracked or verified by an internal court case. The heavy timber frames have been laid down on the dirt. The ungreased wheels are resting in the shade, and the critical tracking voices have completely vanished beneath a blanket of silent, protective dark. You have permission to stop solving your life for tonight. The dry bamboo axles, the cracked oak linchpins, and the transit routes for tomorrow do not require your presence while the ridge is cold. They can remain suspended in the shadows outside your window, completely separate from the living form that is resting here in the quiet. You are under no obligation to repair your entire biography before your eyes are allowed to close. You are permitted to be unwritten, unpolished, and completely finished with the labor, resting within the safe sanctuary of an uncompromised night that asks for no structural performance before it offers you its blanket of rest. The teaching of the quiet timber is settling deep into the marrow of your bones now, filling the heavy spaces across your hips with an enveloping tenderness. You are returning home to the pristine silence that was always waiting beneath your desire to secure the flawless checklist, the vast, unmeasured awareness that cannot be compressed because it belongs to the raw, uncarved bedrock of your own presence. Let the universe carry its own silent turning for the next few hours, while your spirit drifts further away from the language of endless tracking and transactional approval. Your lower spine is loose, your core is heavy like a dark axle pin resting in the lard, and the still rhythm of the evening is cradling your weary body as you prepare to slide away into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep. What if the true purpose of the heavy wooden frame is not to carry the forest until it splinters, but to rest perfectly flat, unladen, and low upon the frozen ground under a winter sky? The frost that gathers along the outer timber beams does not ask the trees to hasten their shedding, nor does the dark mud beneath the carriage stones demand that every wheel be greased before the winter night is permitted to claim the path. All the residual, hot compression that gathered along your lower spine during the hours of tracking your placement among your peers, the exhaustion of trying to outrun a lingering sense of lack, and the subtle, heavy guilt of leaving a project or a path completely undone, all of it is dissolving into the deep, unmoving space of this late hour. The internal driver that keeps your pelvic bowl guarded is running out of momentum because there is no trail left to conquer, no score to settle with your exhaustion, and no unwritten law that declares your fatigue a failure. You are simply here, a physical form breathing in the shadow, entirely separate from the public metrics and performance roles you perform during the daylight hours. When we observe this deep, inner clearing through a quiet and unhurried awareness, we discover that true peace is not a reward earned by successfully reaching the bottom of an infinite column of tasks. It is the radical, simple freedom of changing your relationship with the incompletion itself. allowing the internal landscape to sit unburdened for a season, without transforming that quiet space into a personal indictment. The mind creates the second wound when it takes the raw, physical fatigue of a long day and wraps it in a narrative of failure, whispering that you must continuously carry the weight of the forest to prove that your presence is valid. But the mountain forest does not count the logs that remain on the slope, and the heavy sea rafters do not check the village tallies before they agree to hold their place through the cold. You are allowed to be empty. You are allowed to let the wheels come to a complete halt without believing that the inner chassis has been ruined. Think of how much vital energy has been spent in the late night hours, trying to optimize your tomorrow, replaying the moments where your pacing fell behind, or trying to guarantee that your stamina will be perfectly unyielding when the sun rises. That continuous mental architecture, that defensive looping, that treats every unscheduled hour as a personal emergency that must be corrected before you are permitted to close your eyes, is the very weight that leaves your sacrum feeling so thinned and rigid. But tonight the logging paths are quiet and the mountain shelters are still. The goal you could not hit, or the optimization you missed, is merely a temporary arrangement in a long, complex life of human movement, entirely unable to alter the profound, load-bearing awareness that is cradling your hips right now. You do not have to finish your trajectory to be worthy of this hour, and you do not need to feel completely whole before you let your lower lumbar yield to the dark. Let your focus drop even deeper now, leaving the narrative of your modern obligations behind, and settling fully into the heavy, immovable center of your lower torso. Feel the quiet, supportive mass of your frame as it gives its entire weight to the stillness beneath you, perfectly held by an ancient natural intelligence that operates entirely outside the boundaries of external execution. The deep stone foundations have held the cold cedar beams through countless winters, without needing to generate a single step of forward progress to prove their utility. And your system is fully capable of resting in that exact same unlit security tonight. Every digital update, every uncompleted obligation, and every expectation of absolute performance can remain suspended in the cool evening mist outside, completely powerless to reach into this dark sanctuary. The movement of your breath is becoming so slow, so thin, and so unforced that it feels like nothing more than the faint, rhythmic rustle of dry brush against the outermost timber siding. When the wind has entirely passed into the valley, there is no longer any separation between the immense, dark space of the shed and the stillness that is expanding within the framework of your body. The schedules that were spinning through your mind a few hours ago have turned into pale, translucent vapor, dissolving into the wide, unconditioned landscape of your presence without leaving a single fracture behind. You are returning to the native, untroubled sanctuary that existed long before you ever learned to measure your internal harmony by the speed of your wheel. The silent, unpolished room where you are already wide, already safe, and already deeply at peace. Let the final definitions and roles of the day fall away into the floorboards, leaving your spirit as unmapped, cool, and silent as the unworked timber sitting in the deep shade. There are no expectations to satisfy, no transit tallies to maintain, and no versions of your capacity to defend in this beautiful, protective dark. The world will manage its own weights without your active pull for the next few hours, and the morning will bring its own sky when the light is ready. But right now, in this single pocket of pure presence, nothing is required of your lower spine, but the simple willingness to let the axle drop and rest. Let your mind dissolve completely into the heavy, rhythmic peace of your body, allowing your weary soul to slide effortlessly into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep.